Welcome to Dr. Ziegler Weighs In. I'm Zachary Ziegler, professor of exercise physiology and fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine. I've authored 2 books on weight loss and published dozens of research articles. I'm here to cut through the noise and give you evidence-based insights you can actually use. Now let's dive into the science. Welcome to episode 2. Thank you if you're still here. I appreciate that. I do have to apologize. I'm new at this. I went back and listened to my first episode and kept hitting my hand on my desk, and you could hear that reverberating. And so I'll try. I speak with my hands. I'll try not to do that. Let's start with our weekly news. I'm calling it our weekly news article, our news brief, whatever you want to call it. But let's just take a few minutes and to talk about a study that just came out, and then we're going to get into part 2 of our series on these GLP medications. I chose for an article to review one that came out from the Journal of American Heart Association. Protein has been a topic in nutrition that has been so hotly debated. We will cover protein myths and truths and things like that. Things from I still hear this myth that, you can only absorb 20 grams of protein at any given time. Nonsense. If you eat too much protein, your kidneys are going to get shot. No evidence for that. Things like that. Protein is very misunderstood. This is an interesting study that just said, hey, if you eat more protein, can it lower risk of hypertension? Well, this is a big deal. 90% of every American will be diagnosed with hypertension throughout their lifetime. Okay, and so that's essentially everybody listening here to this podcast. And so if there is some sort of approach to reduce risk for hypertension, I do want it. Now, one of the flaws of this study, which when you're reading the sciences, you always have to understand what the research can and cannot tell you, is it's a review article, but it's just looking at associations. That's all it is. And so we can't put too much stock in it. However, I do think it's interesting. So they followed a whole bunch of individuals. They looked at how much protein they consumed. They broke it down into, is that an animal-based protein or a plant-based protein? They measured risk for hypertension, and this is what they found. Overall, they found the more plant-based protein you consumed, the lower your blood pressure was. When they looked at animal sources of protein, they saw no relationship. Now, let's be clear. Nowhere did they see that consuming more animal-based protein increased blood pressure. They just found that consuming more probably didn't decrease it in the study. Plant-based protein has more L-arginine in it. L-arginine is a precursor to nitric oxide, which relaxes the vessel. It could bring blood pressure down, and that's kind of the theory that the researchers posed. And so, again, animal protein doesn't hurt you, but add some plant-based protein as well, and that may benefit your blood pressure. All right, let's get into episode 2, talking about our 3-episode mini-series on these weight loss medications. And so I'm titling this one, The Game Changer, How GLP-1's Actually Work. And so I think, stay with me. You know, my wife is always getting on me. She says, don't bore people with all the science. And I do get it. But I think it's important for you to understand, especially if you're somebody who is either taking this medication or may take this medication, you probably want to know what this thing is that you're putting in your body. So let's back up a little bit and talk about a landmark finding that took place decades and decades ago. So it was found it's been found that if you were to consume glucose orally in a drink, so I give you, say, 50 grams of glucose in a drink, you drink that. Or I can give you the same amount of glucose administered intravenously. Now think about it. When I give it to you intravenously, it bypasses the gastrointestinal system. Same amount of glucose though. So if I give it to you orally or intravenously, and I was to measure insulin. Now, what's the role of insulin? The role of insulin, so when I consume something with carbohydrates or glucose in it, insulin's going to be released, and insulin will start a process so that I can absorb that glucose and get it into the tissues, okay? Now, when you consume it orally, the amount of insulin that is released is much higher than if you were to intravenously give somebody the same amount of glucose. This is called the incretin effect. The reason this happens is that when I consume the glucose orally, and the glucose has to go through the gastrointestinal system, there are certain peptides. Now, peptides just amino acids, proteins. There are certain peptides that are produced in the intestinal mucosa throughout the small intestine mainly, but other parts of the gastrointestinal system. And the primary peptide is glucagon-like peptide, GLP-1. There are others. The other player is glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, GIP. From here on out, we'll say GLP, GIP. What they found is that these peptides themselves produce insulin and have an effect to aid in absorbing this glucose. So when you're taking that glucose intravenously, you bypass the gastrointestinal system. So GLP and GIP, these peptides are not released, and so there's a different level of insulin that's released. So we've known about GLP-1s for a long time, and it had this effect. Because of this effect, researchers started with looking at GLP-1s in relation to diabetes, thinking, which makes sense, right? Well, if I could give a drug that can promote endocrine cells in the gastrointestinal tract to release insulin, that's beneficial for a diabetic. And so researchers started doing that, looking at diabetes, and there was a lot of success with it. There really was. One particular study published in 2014 in the Lancet looked at 104 weeks, and they were comparing these GLP-1s with some other medications that have been established anti-diabetic medications. And what they found is the GLP-1s were very effective at reducing hemoglobin A1C, but also, which was surprising at the time, today it's not, it also led to more weight loss than the other diabetes medications. And as more and more research started coming out showing, hey, GLP-1s are pretty effective at decreasing risk of diabetes, they said, but they also lost weight. They actually have been shown, and this is important, we will talk about side effects. They're not risk-free, but often I'll get students who will be like, oh, my mom is on this, and I'm really worried. That's usually what the students will say. Yes, their side effects we'll discuss, but really they've had a pretty good history. I brought up in episode 1 fen-phen, and how the FDA approved fen-phen after a single study, and there wasn't long-term research on it. And then as more research came out, the horrors of what fen-phen was doing was brought to light. Well, we have been researching GLP-1s for a while. Don't get me wrong. Yes, there's still more we need to know, but we have, because they've been used as an anti-diabetic medication. And so, and the data that we have seems pretty favorable. One other study on the health benefits, 2016 study published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They randomized over 9,300 patients. They had type 2 diabetes into a group that was given a GLP-1 versus a comparative group. And the group given the GLP-1 had a decreased risk of cardiovascular events by 13%, cardiovascular death by 22%, all-cause mortality by 15%. And so they've been shown to be pretty promising. Now, because they have, in addition to those decreased risk of cardiovascular events, weight loss was also seen. This is where we've seen the shift over the last few years to say, now we're going to approve them for the use of weight loss. And that's where we get all of these names. I'm going to list a few of them. This is not all inclusive. Semaglutide and Ozempic and Wegovy, those are all under this kind of the same category. It's kind of all semaglutide, but different brand names. That's probably the most popular. There's liraglutide, which has been around for a while. That's not nearly as effective, by the way, as semaglutide. And then kind of the new player, the new king right now is trizepatide, Mounjaro, Zepbound. Again, those three, trizepatide, Mounjaro, Zepbound, are kind of all the same, made by different companies, so they have different names. The reason trizepatide seems to be better is it's a GLP-1 and the GIP that we talked about earlier, so it's kind of a combination of two drugs. But and there's let's see, exenatide is out there. There's some other ones. The ones I listed are the biggest. So that's what we're talking about here. These have now become approved for weight loss. Are they effective at doing that? Well, let me highlight some results of some research studies that ask this question. So the first study I'm going to highlight is a meta-analysis, and whenever I use that term meta-analysis, all it is you can kind of think about it as a review article. It isn't the same thing. The big difference is they have analyzed statistically the results of each study and then compared statistically the results of each study to each other. It's a really good way to kind of get a snapshot of kind of what's the landscape here? What do we know about this? And so this was a meta-analysis that was looking at the effects of GLP-1s on a lot of different outcomes, body weight being one of them, which we'll look at, but also lipid profile and some other things. But they included a lot of the GLP-1s out there. And they broke it down to say, well, what's our confidence of evidence on how effective these things are? And they broke it down to saying low confidence, moderate, or high. So the first thing that they looked at, based on all the research that's out there, is its effect on A1C. So for diabetes, kind of the gold standard that we have to say how well are you controlling your glucose is looking at hemoglobin A1C, because it gives you an idea of glucose control over the last roughly 3 months, 90 days-ish. And so it's a really good outcome. And what they found is the level of confidence was very high for tirzepatide, semaglutide, liraglutide, kind of the bigger players on lowering A1C. So that data is out there. We've known it. Very good at doing that. Then they said, okay, well, what about weight loss? The level of confidence of our evidence. Tirzepatide, very high evidence. Semaglutide, very high evidence. Liraglutide, very high evidence, although the level of weight loss isn't as high. The main players out there, and by the way, again, when we're saying semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovy, you can put all that in. That's just, it's the same drug made by different companies. So the level of evidence is really high. The thing that I thought was interesting, and we'll get into more side effects in episode 3 of looking at this mini-series, is looking at common adverse events, though. So first they said, well, okay, well, what's the likelihood of discontinuation? Well, why would researchers want to look at discontinuation? Well, if you can't keep taking a drug, then, well, it doesn't. It's kind of like what I said in episode 1, the most effective exercise program, weight loss approach is one you'll stick to. Well, it's the same thing. If a drug's effective, but you can't keep taking it, then it's not that effective because you're not taking it. And you're probably not taking it because of side effects. And they did find that those same drugs I listed, semaglutide, tirzepatide, the discontinuation rates were really high compared to placebo groups. When they looked at diarrhea, the number of people getting diarrhea while taking those drugs, very high. They looked at those reporting being nauseous, very high, and then vomiting, very high. And it's interesting when you read the results of the paper, the author said, and this is kind of a no-duh, but it's important to note, that those who reported more of these side effects also reported more weight loss. Well, that's not surprising. If you're nauseous and you're throwing up and you have diarrhea, it makes sense you would lose more weight. But these are common side effects. And so again, not risk-free. So they're very effective. Let me give you, just to paint a picture on how effective they are, and then we'll talk about why. I want to paint a picture of kind of our obesity treatment landscape. This is what I mean. Diet and exercise. And when we say, okay, well, how much weight could we expect for diet and exercise? Remember the meta-analysis in episode 1 where they followed them for 4 years and it was roughly a 3% weight loss. So that's kind of what we have with diet and exercise. Roughly the best evidence that we have, long-term weight loss through diet and exercise is 3 to 5% of your starting body weight is kind of what you'd expect long-term. That's not that good. Orlistat, introduced orlistat in episode 1, might get you up to 4%. Orlistat's not that effective, but it's pretty low on the side effects, and so people may want to consume it. Then we get to phentermine. Now, remember fen-phen was a combination of fenfluramine and phentermine. Phentermine is an amphetamine, tons of side effects. It's given readily for weight loss. And you might see 6 to 7% weight loss for phentermine. Naltrone bupropion, that's what had the black box warning for suicidal effects can get up to maybe 8 to 9%, maybe. But again, it has a lot of side effects. There's other drugs I'm not going to get into, but let me jump all the way ahead to semaglutide, maybe 17%. It's a huge jump. We go up to 17%. To put it in perspective, lap band. So under the umbrella of bariatric surgeries, there's a lot of different kinds. We can do gastric bypass, where you're completely bypassing the majority of the stomach. We can do sleeve gastrectomy, where you're creating a little sleeve out of the stomach. Lap band is the least invasive. It's also the least effective. And that gets you about 19% weight loss. Semaglutide's at 17. So it's catching up. But then if we go to trizepatide, which is the most effective form, that's better than lap band. That's up at 22 to 23%. This drug, trizepatide, can give you better weight loss success than lap band, a pretty invasive surgery, I would say. Now it's not the best though. If we go to sleeve gastrectomy, gets you about 25%, and if you the full gastric bypass, about 32%. So that's still better. But the point is, our drugs are catching up to bariatric surgery. Bariatric surgery is hands down the most effective form that we have, and these drugs are catching up. They are effective. Nobody can sit there. Well, before I make the statement I was about to say, you always have one-offs. We're looking at average data, and that's what we're going to be doing in this podcast. On average, this is what we see. Well, if we're being honest, who is average? Well, it's not a person. It's a statistical computation. And so there's those of you listening probably know people that went on this and did not have success, or maybe the side effects were too bad to where they quit. But at the same time, many of you probably know people who went on this and had gobs and gobs of success. And so we're talking about averages here, but nobody can honestly argue from the science that they're not effective. They're effective. So now we go to the mechanism. To really understand the mechanism, we have to understand why bariatric surgery is so effective. Now, old school of thought with bariatric surgery, we used to say, well, people lose weight because of what we call a mechanical model, meaning I shrink the size of the stomach and so they can't eat as much, so they lose weight. Makes sense, right? But there's a lot of evidence that doesn't fit that. What I mean is, when people undergo bariatric surgery, one, they are able to maintain a lot of weight loss. It's almost as if they have reset their, I'm going to use a term here, set point. That all that's saying is kind of your homeostasis. It's almost as if they've reset their homeostasis. Bariatric surgery, we don't attribute its effects to the mechanical model anymore. Now we actually call it metabolic surgery. And the reason that we're saying that is, let's talk about actual bypass surgery. What happens is when they bypass the stomach and they reroute that food, remember these GLPs and GIPs, they're found throughout the gastrointestinal tract and the small intestine, a lot of them, that when that food gets there in a quicker rate, so I mean it's getting the small intestine quicker because it skips the stomach, it causes GLPs, I should say, and GIPs to be released at a greater rate. Well, these GLPs and GIPs, they communicate or have actions on the brain to suppress appetite and food intake. And so the reason bariatric surgeries, now we know this, that the reason that it's so effective, because what we're finding is people, they lose all this weight in bariatric surgery and they're not starving. Now, we'll have some episodes to talk about bariatric surgery. The first few months, 6 months, there's complications and it's difficult. But once you follow these people 1-2 years out, they're maintaining reduced weight and they're not hungry anymore. And we don't see these huge changes that you would expect to see from weight loss. It's probably because the mechanisms that bariatric surgery has on the gut, specifically what's going on with GLP and GIPs. And so by giving somebody then these GLPs, GIPs, and having them inject them, it's kind of like some of the benefits of bariatric surgery in the sense of you're increasing the level of these GLPs, GIPs. It's sending a signal to the brain where the brain says, I'm not hungry. I decrease my appetite. The best, I had a student, I've had multiple students actually on this drug, and whenever we talk about this in class, they come and they want to share their experiences, and not all of them are super positive, but some are, and the common language that the successful ones say about this is they say it decreases food noise. And if you're a dieter, you know what we mean by that. Maybe you haven't used that term, but the constant thinking of food and snacking 24/7, that's what makes dieting horrible. You're always constantly thinking about food and you can't eat that food and all that kind of stuff. And this drug decreases food noise to where you just don't feel the need to eat. And then obviously you lose weight. And so it is getting close to being as effective as weight loss. Previously, pre these drugs, pre GLP-1s, only bariatric surgery has been able to show 20+% of weight loss. And now these drugs too. And there's been studies, there's one I'm looking at right now, which is a meta-analysis that said, are these drugs as good as bariatric surgery? And every study done shows no, bariatric surgery, you're still going to lose more weight. Okay, so it's not as good, but they're catching up to bariatric surgery. And so to kind of recap, these drugs, the mechanism of action is completely different than our prior medications. Our prior medications, mechanisms of action was one with orlistat where it was a fat blocker. Or we have some sort of amphetamine, which acts as a stimulant or appetite suppressant. Well, these GLP-1s are not amphetamines. They're not fat blockers. We'll call them hormones, although that's somewhat debated in the literature. But we'll call it a hormone that has direct effects on the brain's signaling, causing the individual to decrease food intake. And therefore, you lose a lot of weight. Now, in episode 3, I'm going to title it The Reality Check. There are side effects associated with this that we do need to be cognizant of. Please, again, as I said before, subscribe, share with friends where you think this might be information that they would find interesting. And I look forward to seeing, or well, I guess I don't see yet, but I look forward to hopefully having you all listen for our last episode in this mini series on semaglutide.